Good morning, fellas. Welcome back. Today is March 24th, 2021. We are almost finished with the first quarter of the year. That is just absolutely amazing. I've been thinking, how many of you guys are vaccinated now?
I'm
Raise your hands. That's good. It total is that everybody? Because I couldn't see your hands. Dick Schilling, are you vaccinated?
yes,
And
both.
Dick the Cook?
Yes.
So
I'm
it looked like
part.
everybody's
Yeah.
vaccinated. Here we are, here we are just a little over 1 year from the pandemic breakout, and here we are vaccinated. That is, to me, that is something amazing. That really kudos to our modern technology and the people that work tirelessly to provide this to us. And it's we got a lot to be grateful for. So this morning, Steve Schoenig is going to share his story with us, and so we're going to make this the time. And if guys, just feel free to ask Steve questions, and we need to confirm what he's saying is true. So however you want to grill Steve, that's fine. But Steve, welcome, and thanks for joining telling us your story this morning.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I guess I'll start back in history, way back. I'm a native of North Dakota, a state that was described by one of its most famous natives as being the blank spot in the mind of our nation. But, my roots go back fairly far there. My grandfather homesteaded around 1900 on North Dakota prairies, and the other grandfather was a businessman and also an evangelist, Bible teacher in North Dakota.
Huh.
I grew up in a small town. Probably none of you have heard of it. The town's name is Valley City. A small town and a small church. In 1928, my mother's father and her grandfather started a little church there. It was part of the Plymouth Brethren, or well, it still is in existence, part of the Plymouth Brethren, I'll call it movement. The Plymouth Brethren are not a denomination. That's a point of, it's part of their sort of creed, in a sense, is to say they're gathered only unto the name of Christ.
Right.
So through the years, they've struggled with how to describe themselves since they don't have a denominational name. But the Plymouth Brethren, it comes from their English roots in Plymouth, England, starting in, I'm not sure, maybe it was the early 1800s, men and women that chose to leave the Anglican Church and to, in a sense, gather in what they considered to be a way of meeting as a church more in keeping with what you would read about in the first few chapters of the book of Acts. Anyway, I grew up in a group that met like that. There was a lot of teaching for us from an early age. I was taught that the matter of salvation was a personal one. That at some point in time, it was up to me to make that decision to say, I welcome Jesus Christ into my life. I confess that I'm a sinner and rely solely on his work on the cross. And I did that one night when I was 7 years old. It still is with me. It's stuck, so to speak. At about 6 years old, when I was 6 years old, my father built a house several miles out of this small town. We had a small acreage, and I would sort of characterize my life in the 1960s as focusing a lot on outdoor activities. Things were not dangerous, except maybe dangerous physically. So there was a lot of time spent outside, and the Plymouth Brethren being a group that sort of teaches separation from the world and I would say deadness to the world. Some activities were not allowed, but outdoor activities such as sledding and tobogganing, bicycle riding, climbing trees, so on, all of that was very much allowed at all hours of the day and into the night if we wanted. In that Plymouth Brethren church, I had 7 cousins, and we were all sort of in that together in a sense that we were sort of gathered apart from the world, even though we all went to public school and so on. A number of those cousins really, to this day, are as close as my 2 siblings are to me. And that was, I mentioned that because that was really a gift that was part of my upbringing. My father liked to travel. He decided it was better to wear the soles of his shoes a little more thin and see more of the world. Maybe that comes with growing up in North Dakota, I don't know. But by the time I was age 12, we had done 2 road trips to Florida, a road trip to Mexico. We had spent a couple of weeks in Colorado. So we got around a lot in addition to camping in Minnesota. Sort of the freedom of childhood and play and so on became somewhat of a memory at about age 12. I have one older brother. He's 3 years older than I am. He's a go-getter. He was always interested in business endeavors, and literally from a young age. And by the time I was age 12, my older brother had gotten into beekeeping, and he hired me to help him, and also I became somewhat of a partner in that. And in our years of beekeeping, we eventually had 40 beehives. It was a lot of work, particularly in the fall. North Dakota is a great honey producing state. And in our final year, our final full year of beekeeping in 1969, we sold and marketed, processed and marketed 2.5 tons of honey.
Wow.
I still have 1 remaining jar of honey from that era. We called it Schoenig Brothers Apiary. And the honey is still sort of liquid in this jar. It's over 50 years old now.
Wow.
For some reason, it has turned dark. The honey from that era was primarily from alfalfa and what they called sweet clover. And it was liquid gold. It was light and clear. For a bottle like I just held up, we charged $1 for that, 3 pounds of it. I think today now that would probably be $12 or $13 at Sam's Club or Osco. Yeah. Costco, not Osco. Anyway, in 1970, my father came home on my 16th birthday and told the family, actually we were a family of 3 then because my 2 older siblings had moved to Fort Collins. Prior to this, my father came home. He was a construction worker and said the house that he was contracted to do inside finish work on during the winter months, that contract had fallen through and he didn't have a job. And so you don't start new construction in North Dakota in midwinter. So we moved to Fort Collins. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago in our Moot House study, I went to Poudre High School here in Fort Collins and became invisible. I didn't really have a group that I fit into. But I quickly I don't know that I earned it, but I was chosen by a young fella 1 year younger than me to sort of become his best friend. And I had a driver's license at that point. He did not. And I had a driver's license, but no spending money. He had spending money because his father and mother ran a bakery, Fuller's Bakery here in Fort Collins.
Wow.
It was in the building that's now Uno Mas Taqueria here in Fort Collins. Anyway, he worked in his parents' bakery, had money. So he soon got me a job in his parents' bakery so that I would have spending money so that when we weren't working, we could do things. And he's a good friend to this day. Moving here to Fort Collins, we joined ourselves, of course, to a small Plymouth Brethren church that was at that point quite young. We met in a building off of West LaPorte Avenue that was part of the Forney Industries complex. It was an experience in a lot of ways. I remember a young woman after one of the church services, because the music was so dreadful. She said, well, when the Lord returns in the rapture, this builder or this group is going first because it says the dead in Christ will rise first. Sort of gives you an idea of the way life was then. But the group, the Plymouth Brethren group, grew and began to flourish. We purchased a building at the corner of Oak and Whitby, an old church building that's still there today. And I finished high school as an unknown. Went on to study history at CSU. I pursued a degree in history for 3 years and sort of couldn't figure out what I would do with that degree if I attained it, except to maybe teach school. And after 2 experiences here in schools in Fort Collins, I realized I really didn't want to teach history, even though I still loved it. A little bit of a crisis point. What am I going to do? I'm 3 years into this and I don't like what I'm pursuing here. And at that point, at the end of the summer of 1976, I was ready to go back to school, even though I was uncertain of why. And I was offered a job at a savings and loan as a teller, and I jumped at it to get out from under the burden of not knowing what I was going to do. And I was sort of tired of studying when several friends didn't have that responsibility. I worked at Home Federal Savings here in Fort Collins for 4 years, and then in 1981, the older brother that I mentioned, who always had business pursuits in mind, had started a business called Ultimate Support Systems. He offered me a job, and I worked for the next 23 years at Ultimate Support Systems here in Fort Collins. My career path has been, I would call it zigzag, and it was sort of a zigzag career path at Ultimate. Although most of the years at Ultimate, I was involved with human resource work. And a lot of you know Rob Strauss, who's sort of the founding father of this particular fellowship. Rob Strauss was also an employee of Ultimate Support Systems. And he and I in 1988 were sort of empowered to work actively on the fulfillment of the mission statement of the company, which was not only to make stands primarily for musicians, but to basically share the life and love of Jesus Christ with our fellow employees and with the world at large. And so Rob and I were empowered to work in that ministry. And it was a great experience. We were oftentimes quite well funded to do things that you probably wouldn't be able to do in a normal corporate situation. And we had a lot of adventures with that. During that time at Ultimate Support Systems, I'll call her a young woman, although we were approaching middle age by this point, moved to Fort Collins. And after I offered her, I had known this woman named Miriam in the early 1970s. After offering her a job twice, the second time she decided to come to work at Ultimate Support Systems. And she later became my wife in 1987. A wonderful thing, a wonderful gift of God to me. We don't have any children. We have 13 nieces and nephews. Most of those are here in Fort Collins. They're sort of a bit like our kids, and they're wonderful. We have taken a number of them on trip experiences and so on. Excuse me just a moment here. Carl, I'm doing a Zoom broadcast right now, and Mike has me on recording here. Are you having difficulty? What's that? Yeah. Well, just a moment here.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Mike, do you want to stop the recording for a minute so Carl can get on?
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, I think Carl, yeah, let's just go ahead and record.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Carl.
That's okay. I need to get in before 7, right?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
I think he can join anytime.
Yeah, give it a try again.
Okay, very good. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So where was I? Well, so that was,
Wife.
yeah. Anyway, those nieces and nephews, of course, they obey us implicitly, even in ways they wouldn't obey their parents, sort of like being grandparents. Back to Fort Collins. So it was in the, I guess, late 1970s that I met Mike and Sandra Hadorf when they joined the Fort Collins Bible Chapel.
Yep.
And by the 1980s, both Mike and I were sort of in the harness at the chapel. You know, the Plymouth Brethren generally have on Sunday at least one service that's about an hour long that is open to the men to audibly participate in prayer, in asking for a particular hymn to be sung, in sharing a portion of scripture, and so on. This meeting, I call it a meeting, would end with communion. Anyway, as a young man, you're encouraged to participate audibly. And by the time I had finished high school, I had begun to be asked to speak, deliver the sermon at other meetings and at other services. I cringe now when I think of what some of those sermons might have consisted of, the content. But the Lord was gracious, and Mike can relate to this. By the mid 1980s, after several, I would call them flourishing years as a church, we began to, as a congregation, split and part ways and so on. Folks have asked me, Mike and I were both in various leadership roles at that time. Folks have asked me, well, why? What happened to the church? Because it eventually closed its doors. As a congregation, it is no more. I think to sum it up, I've said, well, we were real good at doing weddings and funerals together and other events like that. We just weren't real good at doing church together anymore. But it was a learning process, as I think Mike will attest for both of us. And God launched us out onto a wider ocean of fellowship at that point. Anyway, I hadn't finished that degree in history, and in 1990, while I was still employed at Ultimate Support Systems, I pursued a year-long non-traditional degree completion program at Colorado Christian University. And by the time I finished that, I was very interested in seminary and managed to squeeze then in the years following a 2-year degree. I squeezed it into 5 years. Master's in counseling. By the time I finished that, the stats in terms of the glut of professional counselors, psychologists, and so on here along the Front Range of Colorado meant that there weren't many job possibilities or good income producing possibilities, and I still needed to keep weenie roast on the table. And so I continued to work at Ultimate Support Systems. To some degree, the counseling, my education in that was a great addition to my sort of my toolbox at work in working with Rob Strauss and doing ministry in the company. By 2004, I realized my career ladder at Ultimate Support Systems was leaning against a crumbling wall, and resigned from Ultimate Support Systems and went to work part-time for a financial advisor as his assistant. It was really a wonderful job change. I loved the work, even though I like words and music and that kind of thing. I found that I like numbers when they work in a bookkeeping sense, when there's accuracy involved and so on, and when you're not mixing up algebraic equations and working with, that's algebra is letters and numbers together, and that shouldn't be. Anyway, so it was a great job working part-time. That part-time job allowed me to start pursuing some goals aside from career goals. I still love history, and I've pursued that more in a personal sense in terms of doing a lot of genealogy work, family genealogy and history. That led me in the early 2000s to a crumbling rural church in a rural section of eastern Iowa that has roots in the Schoenig family heritage. My German ancestors that came from Germany up the Mississippi River helped build this church. And since then, I've worked on a restoration of this little country church. It's been just really a great adventure. Made a lot of friends in eastern Iowa as a result. And in 2010, we had the church restored to do a Christmas service. It was the first service held in this church in 100 years. So that was really a lot of fun. It does not have a congregation. It's a historical artifact that's used for special events and weddings and so on. Another pursuit during this years of working part-time, my mother had produced an autobiography in the early 70s. It had never been published, and I edited her work to some degree, and we did self-publishing of that. That was very rewarding. Gave her a lot of joy in the last years of her life. And I was caring for aging parents. Both of my parents ended with dementia, and we kept them in their own home. My dad until his ending days, my mom until about 5 months before she died. And a lot of travel as well. Years ago, I was riding the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad, got to talking to a senior citizen, and he said if I was younger, I would wear my shoes a little bit thinner and see more of the world. And that was not too difficult to take that to heart. So I have one more continent in the world that I would like to set foot on someday, and that's the continent of Antarctica. We'll see. But overall, looking back, I was given a rich heritage, not perfect, but the Plymouth Brethren background was a rich, godly heritage full of a lot of good Bible teaching. I was given a wonderful family and a wonderful life partner in Miriam. Had some great church relationships. I'm living in a privileged part of the world. What can I say? Even being from North Dakota, I'll say it was a privileged part of the world. I've been spiritually and materially blessed. And so I think maybe to sum it up, what came to mind here as I was prepping for this, the 6th verse of Psalm 16, the boundary lines. I get touched when I think of what I've been given.
Yeah.
The boundary lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. I have a delightful inheritance.
Wow.
And that's sort of my story.
Wow.
That's part of it anyway. You're great listeners. Thank you.
That was absolutely beautiful.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Steve.
Love that verse, and so true, Steve. Well, you're a man that just exudes the love of God and the gratefulness of what you've been given. That is not only true this morning, but continually. As I've known you for decades, that has been true about you.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's encouraging.
You told a story once, and while you were talking, there is so much more you could have said about your father and your mother, of whom I love dearly. Your mother was a counselor to me on several occasions, and your father, I just loved being around him. But there's something, when I think of Henry, I think of a man very, very quiet. And you told a story once about when you were kids, and of course you guys like to travel, and but you didn't really know where you were going to go. I guess you had these vacation plans, but nobody knew, because that's kind of, could you kind of fill in the blanks and then talk about going to the on ramp and then making the decision there? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, yeah. So this acreage that we had there outside of this small town in North Dakota was on the first section of interstate highway that North Dakota built. It was just off an exit ramp there. And that plays into the story. So I think this was the 1963 trip when we chose to go to Florida. But my father was not only quiet, he was a master of indecision. He usually let decisions come his way rather than he making them proactively. And this was one of those situations. So being a builder of homes, when you took your vacation in North Dakota, it was ideal to do it Christmas, New Year's, and get out of North Dakota's winter weather. You get my drift. And so it was right around Christmas time, and we knew we were going to go somewhere warmer. But the family debated between California and Florida. And as I recall it, by the night before we were to leave, we had our bags packed for a warmer climate, but we still hadn't decided between those two destinations. And the next morning we got in the car. Of course, being a good farm boy, you had to leave early on these trips. So, we got up in the darkness of a winter night in North Dakota, got in the car and drove it would have been about a 3-block distance to the interchange there on the interstate. And we still hadn't decided if we took the on-ramp to the right, we would head west and go toward California. If we went across the interstate and took the left on ramp, we would head east and eventually end up in Florida. And so we sat there in the darkness for a few minutes while the family debated which way to go. And I'm not sure who cast the deciding vote. We went across the interstate, turned left, and went to Florida. And I've loved Florida ever since.
That's amazing.
Favorite destination to this day.
I think that's so funny.
Unbelievable.
Is your family from a German Russian descent from that whole story?
We're not. I'm really, I got a mix of the gene pool, but the German part is North German, and the section of Germany right up, choking up next to Denmark. And the best that we know from family history is my great grandfather and his 3 brothers chose to emigrate because that was an area, that border between Germany and Denmark was contested over the years. And at times it became Danish, and at other times when Germany was strong enough, it went in favor of Germany. And my great grandfather and his 4 brothers got tired of fighting their neighbors.
Yeah.
Periodically, and so they chose to leave to escape that ongoing sort of conflicted area. It's not anymore. So yeah, I'm very North German in terms of the German heritage.
Yeah.
But that was
Steve, I wanted to
go ahead.
thank you for your story, Steve, and tell you that, this year or so that I've known you since the Moot House, and you're bringing in different hymns and having us sing them and such. It's interesting to see what made you happen, because I would look at you and see this kind Christian guy, solid, I'll be you when I grow up kind of guy. And it didn't just happen. This is something that took a while. You were, it's quite a story. It's like Lake Wobegon or something. I mean, it really is quite a story to develop into what you are today. And it was very enlightening. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, in that era, now that a lot of the remaining Plymouth Brethren groups, I'll call it that because my sense is the Plymouth Brethren groups are a dwindling number worldwide. But back in that era of being sort of fully separate from the world as much as you could and so on, one of the things that was available to us was, you went, well, in the North Dakota region, in the winter you went ice skating. And then the youth group, gathered in somebody's house for hot chocolate and so on afterwards. Well, what are you going to do? You could sing hymns around the piano, and that was something that was allowed. Or if you were camping in the summer, which we did a lot of, you sang hymns and choruses around the campfire. So yeah, the Lake Wobegon thing. When I was introduced to Garrison Keillor, and started listening to his Lake Wobegon tales, there's just so much of that sort of that northern upper Midwest subculture that I could identify with. There are times they're just almost physically rolling on the floor with laughter with how he could bring out that subculture. So yeah, it was Lake Wobegon in a lot of ways. Yeah.
So Steve, you're retired now.
Yes.
So how is your retirement going? And what words of wisdom would you have for the rest of us?
Good question.
The words of wisdom are, well, to answer your first question, retirement is just, it's 6 days of Saturday followed by a 7. It's the greatest thing, but it is not just like, let's just get up and drink our morning coffee and then go down for a nap and then watch game shows and wait until darkness comes. The best advice that I ever received was, you don't need to, you need to think about more than what you're retiring from. You need to think about what you're going to retire to. And I've been given a lot to retire to, like the Old Stone Church project in Iowa. There's just, yeah, it's a privilege. I think we all realize we're at a stage of life where you realize what a precious gift time is. As someone said, I can make more dollars, but I can't make any more time. And that retirement is a gift of time that's just, it is wonderful.
When I first came to the Moot House, one of the connections that I had gotten to that was my wife's relationship or connection to your mom. And I think mainly it was the book. Could you tell us a little bit more about the book and background with your mom and whatever? Because I know I've forgotten a lot of the details of that, and I'd like to hear it again, actually. And I think the group might want to hear it.
Well, thank you, Tatsi. Just a moment here. I'll turn my back on you guys and grab a copy of the book so I can show you the cover. So Tatsi's wife, Vicky, right? Tatsi?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Vicky is a good friend of a longtime friend and acquaintance of our family, Gene Olson. Gene and Mike went to the Plymouth Brethren group here in Fort Collins when it was active in the 1980s. Anyway, that's the connection, Tatsi.
Ah, okay. I didn't realize that. And
Yeah.
I play cards with them just about every week. I didn't realize that.
Tell a small world. You tell them hello. They're a they're a lovely couple.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was, I forget anyway, Jean had learned about my mom's book and that we had self-published it. I don't know if that shows up or not in the screen, but it was a joy to publish this book called Peculiarly Yours. I can't pronounce the title, even though I helped edit the book. So anyway, one afternoon, Jean and Totsy's wife, Vicky, came to my mom's house and we warmed up a pot of tea and both, I think Vicky, I think your wife was interested in meeting my mom after reading the book. I think Jean had recommended the book to Vicky. So my mom banged this autobiography out on a typewriter in the early 70s and sent it off to a few publishers, but getting published is a little bit like obtaining credit. You have to, you know how you have to have had credit to obtain more credit. You have to have been published to be published. And so the publishing never happened. You have to be famous already or something to get published. So when, you know, the electronic age that we live in now, you can easily publish materials online and so on. And so that's basically what I pursued in 2005 to get this book published. The autobiography ends in the early years of my parents' marriage. There could have been a sequel to it, I suppose, but I think it would have been pretty embarrassing to me and to my siblings. So that never happened, but I wanted to get it published as sort of I guess, an addition to the scarcity of North Dakota literature of what it was like years ago living in North Dakota. You know, my grandfather, when he homesteaded, you didn't have the time, and then I suppose in some cases, probably a lot of those homesteaders didn't have the skill to write about their experiences. So when I began to do genealogy work, it's like, I wonder what it was like for my grandfather as a single man to homestead on the prairies around the turn of the century. And how do I find that out? My grandfather had passed on in 1971. So I started searching for literature written by others of their homesteading experiences to try to get an idea of what it was like, and found there wasn't much of that either. Well, in the early 2000s, when I picked up my mom's old manuscript, my mom grew up in the same small town that I grew up in North Dakota. Her father was a businessman, a church planter, an evangelist. And I thought her story would add to what little literature there is of what it was like to be in a small town in North Dakota. But I found that I couldn't, the primary source of publishing of this type of work at the North Dakota State University kindly responded to me and said, the book's a little too familial and a little too personal to add to that limited literature category. We're not interested in publishing it, but it's a treasure for me now to have it. And the nice thing about self-publishing in this day and age is you don't have to order a garage full of books when you get published, because it can be published on demand. So it's still available for new purchase and used on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and that. So
Amazing.
I don't know if I've answered your question, Totsy, but thank you
That's
for
great.
asking.
Yes.
Steve,
Thank you.
Steve, you gave me a copy and my wife and I both read it. It's an amazing story. And in addition, as I recall, there was a poem at the end of each chapter, and they were beautiful poems. What a poet she was.
Was a good book.
And I guess she composed a poem every morning, didn't she?
Well, it almost seems like it. I should count sometime. I know we have in the hundreds of poems that she left us. She oftentimes wrote poems for special occasions, you know, for wedding anniversaries for folks, or birthdays, or just, yeah, a lot of that. Baby showers, you know, and she was invited, she would come with a poem particular, you know, specific to the person in the situation. So yeah, she was, some of the poems are quite deep. The Women of the Word Bible study group that has gone on for years at Faith Church here in Fort Collins used a number of her poems as sort of introductory material to the studies that Retha Saylor had put together for that ongoing women's Bible study endeavor. Yeah, so yeah, her poems are, I didn't get that. I like words, but I can't wordsmith them into poems. That part of the DNA didn't get passed down to me. And I've shared, you know, back when we were meeting physically at the Moot House, you know, I used a number of her short poems to introduce the hymns that we were singing there after she passed away in 2018. So,
Boy, I really miss that aspect of our meetings. Is the sharing and singing of those hymns that you would bring us to. I really miss that, Steve.
thank you. I miss it too, and you know, it's going to when we do get back together, we won't have Everett with us physically on the violin. We'll see what we can do with just our voices.
Yeah, it should go just fine.
So I love contemporary a lot. There's some really great music continuing to be produced, as I call it, at least in my evaluation, my estimation, by contemporary Christian musicians. But I love the old hymns as well. It's all a great library of heritage, and there's, you know, the music part, words put to music will stay with you in a way that that's almost sort of mysterious how that gets tucked away. When my mom was well into her years of dementia, she could still recall the words to hymns and play on the piano and so on. Music is they have found that music is one of the last things to leave a person when they're losing their mental powers through dementia and Alzheimer's. So it's a powerful medium of communication.
Well, Steve, you and I do share a lot of I would say my primary Christian nurturing were the Plymouth Brethren. Profound impact on me. And I've always admired you as a man who totally has embraced and learned very positively and appreciative about that heritage, which, as we both know, was quite mixed. I think both of us have become, you know, different individuals. And you know, I know you're not prepared for this question, but in what ways, again, embracing your past and appreciative of that heritage, but yet understanding that it was mixed. There's some very great aspects and some, you know, not so great aspects. In what ways have that whole mix, has that influenced you, and how has it changed you into the man you are today? And or maybe a simpler question is, how have you changed?
Great question. You know, I look back on my upbringing in that Plymouth Brethren movement. It laid a great foundation. but sort of like maybe like concrete. Some of the aggregates that are in it have lasting value, and some of the aggregates start to deteriorate over time. And there's some aspects of the Plymouth Brethren movement that I've sort of had to say, okay, I'll take the meat and leave the bones here. One of the bones is somewhat the there ends up being somewhat of a legalistic outlook in certain aspects of how you live life, and I hope I have let go of some of that, but I guess the introduction to the scope of Scripture was invaluable to me, and that has remained. I guess where I have journeyed since leaving the Plymouth Brethren in 1988, there's a great freedom in Christ to when you agree on sort of the essentials of new life in Christ. You can fellowship broadly, and I love. Well, I'm having trouble answering you, Mike. I just Miriam and I love going back and going to, occasionally going to a Plymouth Brethren gathering in the Denver area. The folks love on us. We love on them. I still, when Miriam and I go back to North Dakota, we go to the little Plymouth Brethren church there, and that I grew up in, and I find if I don't worry too much, if I don't think about the legalism, and I just think about how we share in the love of Christ, we're blessed, and we receive, we're fed. And hopefully we're a blessing to those when we visit, and I think I could probably have the same if I had been raised in the Methodist Church or the Presbyterian or whatever. When you find that stream of life in Christ, it doesn't matter what denomination it's flowing through. The water is drinkable, and it's life-giving. So I guess that's what I've learned. I'm not a dispensationalist. The Plymouth Brethren were sort of a hotbed of dispensational theology. I appreciate it as a way of attempting to frame and explain God's dealings with his creation over time, but I don't adhere to it in a strict sense anymore. So that changed for me as well, in large part as a result of going to Denver Seminary, which I found at Denver Seminary, it's conservative Baptist in its roots, but once again they're open to the water of life, in whatever source it's flowing from when it comes from God, and that was very eye-opening to me.
Great response to that off-the-cuff question. Thank you. Yeah. Well, we got a little more time for a few more questions or comments on Steve. So.
Well, let me just say, Mike, I guess maybe in the 1980s, as things at Fort Collins Bible Chapel began to fragment, I wasn't at all certain that our paths would continue to be sort of interlaced. but here we are years later, and consider it a real gift that we are still together in oneness and fellowship, in large part through what Rob Strauss started around 1990 with this fellowship. And here I am. I'm still receiving teaching from you, and that's a great part of the rich heritage that I have as well.
Yeah, it's what we share together, because that's where that's what deeply influenced me, to hear a man get up on a Sunday morning who's a businessman or a plumber or a counselor or some theologically trained, most were not, but to open the scriptures and say, turn this morning to 2 Samuel chapter 2 as I read the text. That's how we would do it in those days. And I sat in the pews as a young man saying, I'd give my eye teeth to be able to do something like that. And here we are. We are in our 60s still. Yeah. Deep, rich heritage. Yeah. I too am grateful. So
it is.
Well, thank you, fellas, for joining in today. We'll pick up next week, and thanks to Steve for that. And as I said, I will finish the recording and then post it on the Christ in the Rockies website, along with the remainder of our study. And it'll be dedicated, this session will be dedicated strictly to Steve's talk. And next week, we'll pick up in the Gospel of John. We'll be looking at chapter 7, 1 through 9. And we'll see you all then. Thanks for
Mike. Hey, Mike.
Yeah, John.
I'll ask Steve one more question. Maybe it'll wrap it up for us.
Why doesn't that surprise me?
Got a couple minutes. No, I don't want to waste them. So, Steve, in Psalm 16:6, some of us would say, wow, where did you find that? But it says, the measuring lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Tell us a little bit about this idea of measuring lines. What in the world?
Well, I'll play my hand of ignorance here, because it's been years since I studied that out. I'll say it's a hunch here. Don't take this one to the bank.
You're in a safe group. So
yeah, I have a feeling it had to do with how the ancient Israelites may have allocated land to themselves as they settled in the land of Canaan. Where your tribe was assigned a portion of the promised land, so to speak. I think it has to do with that what you were given as your part of where you were going to settle.
So, I mean, it finishes up and says, indeed, my inheritance is beautiful to me. So yes. I'm sure you're thinking this is more than just, the land I've been allotted.
Exactly. Well, right. Yeah. And I'm doing something here with this verse, I guess, that maybe characterizes a lot of at least the older Plymouth Brethren theologians. They became known somewhat as hypertypers. So all these pictures, particularly from the Old Testament, I'll call them pictures, were a type of something that was fulfilled or is being fulfilled in New Testament theology, if you will. So I'm hypertyping here and saying this sort of what may have been a thankfulness for what was physically allocated to a people group back in the time of the writing here. I'm typing that as okay, I apply that to myself in a spiritual sense. Does that, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm sort of going out on a limb here with this, but to me, it speaks to me of that in our present day and age and the way God deals with us.
That's great. Yeah, well, good. Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming, Steve, especially this morning. What you shared with us was so meaningful. So have a good week, you guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. So bye for now.
Thanks,
you.
Steve.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, Steve.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.